You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. All right, everyone. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and if you recognize the quote at the start of the episode, you are a nerd, so I am very glad you're here with us. For the rest of you who are going, what the heck is he talking about? The line that we started the episode with today, what holds more truth, history or prophecy? That is the opening line in the new show, Dune Prophecy. And if you are listening to this episode on our release date, that means that tonight is also the final episode of Season 1 of Dune Prophecy. So maybe I shouldn't be tying that in too much to this episode here, since we don't know how the season ends yet, but I am going to do it anyway. And for those of you who are sitting here going, did I click on the right podcast? I thought this was going to be about Christmas. Why are we talking about Dune? Well, we are going to be talking about both today. We're actually going to be talking about Christmas through the lens of Dune. And if you are not a science fiction nerd, don't worry, I will explain the connection with Dune in a minute here, at least as best as I can, because it is a very expansive world to try to explain. For Christmas this year, I wanted to focus specifically on Christmas through the lens of prophecy and the prophecies about Jesus' birth that many Christians often look to, usually coming from the Old Testament. Because while many pastors in the past couple weeks and even this week will be talking about all the different ways the Old Testament points to Jesus, well, it's not necessarily as clean-cut and obvious as we often like to think. And there is no better cultural lens through which to view biblical prophecy than that of Dune. Not just because Dune is quite popular right now, with a couple recent movies from Denis Villeneuve, as well as the current TV show, but also because the storyline revolves so heavily on the concept of prophecy and a Messiah figure. So for those who are not familiar with the Dune storyline, let me do my best to give you a quick summary, at least just of the key plot points from the main book, because there have been roughly around 24 novels that have been written within the Dune universe, and a lot of them tend to be quite large, so we're just going to focus on the main stuff here. Dune is a novel from the 1960s written by Frank Herbert. In many ways, the storyline is similar to Star Wars, particularly when you get into some of the expanded universe of Star Wars, and Lucas did acknowledge inspiration from Herbert's work, but it's also different in some key aspects. So the general storyline is that several thousand years into the future, humanity has created basically AI, like robots are called thinking machines. The robots take over the world, the humans have to fight back, and then for thousands of years after that, that kind of technology is outlawed. And the galaxy is ruled over by these different houses, kind of like Game of Thrones style sort of thing, where like each planet or region is ruled over by a particular house, and they all pay allegiance to the Emperor. However, the control that the Emperor has over the galaxy is tenuous in some ways, and he gets a little nervous about this one particular Duke from House Atreides. So in order to get rid of Duke Leto Atreides, he sends him to this desert planet called Arrakis, very much like Tatooine from Star Wars. But the only reason anyone cares about Arrakis is there's this particular hallucinogenic spice that can only be found there. And so the planet had previously been under control of the Atreides' longtime rivals, the Harkonnens. So the Emperor says, we're going to remove the Harkonnens from controlling Arrakis, we're going to put the Atreides in there. But what the Atreides didn't realize at first, they figured out relatively quickly, is that the Emperor had made a deal with the Harkonnens to betray the Atreides once they get settled on Arrakis. So the storyline follows then as the Atreides try to get settled on there, the Harkonnens attack, Duke Atreides gets captured, his concubine and their son, Paul, escape, and they come across this local tribe called the Fremen. The Fremen live on Arrakis. A lot of people don't even realize that they exist there. And at first, the Fremen are quite scared of and skeptical of Paul and his mother, even possibly looking to kill them, until they realize that Paul and his mother have special abilities. His mother was a member of the Bene Gesserit, which is this whole long convoluted storyline in Dune. In fact, that's basically what the new TV show Dune Prophecy is about. It's telling you the background of this Bene Gesserit group. It is an all-female clan essentially of like witches. They have some supernatural power. And one of the things they're particularly skilled at is being able to determine if someone is lying. So they have contracted out their services to each of the main houses to be truth sayers for them, to be able to say, oh, hey, this person's telling you the truth or that one's lying. But what not a lot of people realize is they're also working behind the scenes to change the course of history itself. And they have even been selectively intermarrying the different houses to try to get a messiah-like figure that they called the Kwisatz Haderach. And they had been working for centuries and even millennia to breed this perfect superhuman that could basically take over the empire and rule the galaxy. Through various events, Jessica, Paul's mom, was supposed to help this Kwisatz Haderach to come into existence in the next generation, but she went rogue and tried to turn Paul into this figure. So she is dealing with thousands of years of prophecies about this messianic-like figure that's going to come along, and she has decided, I want this to be my son. So she shapes him and molds his life to the point that he could possibly be the fulfillment of these prophecies. And when they get to Arrakis, the Fremen recognize him as a messiah-like figure from their own culture that they call the Lisan al-Gaib. Yes, I know there are a lot of really weird names in Dune that you just have to get used to. It's part of the storytelling in there. What you kind of realize the more you read along is that this prophecy of the Lisan al-Gaib that the Fremen have was made up by the Bene Gesserit because they figured that once they created this Kwisatz Haderach, they would have to end up on Arrakis at some point. So they fed this into the religion of the Fremen, into the culture of the Fremen, so that when they would inevitably eventually have to end up on Arrakis, the Fremen would be willing to accept this person as their messiah and basically back them with an army. So it's this whole convoluted thing. And then the rest of the story follows Paul as he kind of goes through a hero's journey, but then also in some ways becomes a little bit of an anti-hero. I'll try not to spoil too much there, but he's a very complex figure who ends up leaning into his role as this messiah figure more than he originally wanted to, when he kind of feels like his hands are tied by his heritage and his fate. The more he learns about who he is and where he came from and who his ancestors were, he just sees it as kind of inevitable that he plays this role in the galaxy for better or for worse, and it does have both better and worse aspects to it. At one point, I believe this is put into the second movie, Lady Jessica, Paul's mother, says, you cannot see the future without seeing the past. And then the line that we opened up with today, what holds more truth, history or prophecy? I thought these were really good linchpins to take our conversation of biblical prophecy through the lens of Dune. Because so often, I think when Christians hear this idea of Jesus fulfilling prophecy or the Bible having prophecy, I mean, if you're anything like me, you kind of had this idea of the ancient biblical writers, like from the Old Testament, say the prophets or something like that, sitting down and God giving them a vision, basically of Jesus. Like they see this figure, Jesus, who is going to save their people and save the world and, fix all of the wrongs of humanity. And so Moses and Hosea and Elijah, or whoever you want to fill in the blank, they were looking forward specifically to Jesus. Or maybe you acknowledge that they might not have thought of Jesus himself because they wouldn't have known that, but they were looking for some specific Messiah figure who would fill out this whole role. Like maybe they didn't know his name was Jesus, but they were looking for someone who was doing exactly what Jesus did. And then this was the plight of every Jewish family until the time of Jesus, is that they were just waiting and waiting for this Messiah to be born. I mean, I remember being taught growing up that Jewish mothers in the ancient world wanted more and more children so that they could have more boys, which would be a better chance at giving birth to the Messiah. And while I appreciate how much Christians care so much about Jesus that they are trying to study these scriptures and find hyperlinks back and forth that maybe aren't so obvious, we also have to be very careful that we don't read Jesus into a passage that wasn't necessarily talking about him. Or even if you want to take the position that the passage can have two different meanings because, maybe God knew it would refer to Jesus, but the prophet didn't, we have to realize that there is not going to be an Old Testament passage, a passage from Genesis to Malachi, that was solely written for Jesus to fulfill it. Because the Bible, whether we're talking Old or New Testament, it was relevant for the people of its day. So if we have, say, Isaiah getting this vision from God, and it's all about this prophecy of a forthcoming Messiah, well, that means it's not going to have any meaning necessarily for him or his people for generations, because Isaiah lived several hundred years before Jesus. And yeah, I guess you could say, oh, well, they were just being reminded to look forward to that. Okay, well, I think there's more that we can dig into these passages than just that. We have to remember our Bibles are primarily Jewish literature. Even the New Testament is almost exclusively Jewish literature written by Jewish people about Jewish people. And that's certainly true of the Tanakh, what we as Christians often call the Old Testament. So it was their scriptures before Christianity split off from Judaism and tried to reinterpret these texts. So that means that they meant something for hundreds of years before this new sect of Judaism called Christianity came about and started reinterpreting the texts. So please understand, as we go through this conversation here today, I am not trying to be a heretical version of Ebenezer Scrooge who comes in and bah humbugs your entire theology about Jesus' birth. My goal is not to tear down your faith or tell you that you can't think of particular passages as foreshadowing Jesus, or I'm certainly not saying that Jesus isn't important. I'm a Christian myself, and I believe that Jesus is extremely important, and I believe that the Bible is a very important set of documents as well. So I just want to present this in a way that shows what the text would have meant in its own context. And if that's different from how we have viewed it, that's not the fault of the text, and that's not me trying to destroy your faith. That is the fault of the people who have misinterpreted these texts for generations now and just continue to pass it on without taking the time to try to learn what the text would have meant in its original context. And this brings us back to those Dune quotes, because if we are going to understand prophecy, we have to understand history. We can't try to talk about what these passages would mean in the future without actually seeing, as Lady Jessica said, what they mean in the past. I think what we'll find through much of this study is that history is true, and prophecy is a reinterpretation of that history for the present to have a hope for the future. So without further ado, let's get talking about the prophecies of Jesus' birth in the Bible. I think it would be helpful for us here to define two key terms of this discussion. The first is prophecy, and the second is fulfillment. What is prophecy? Well, I think a lot of people view that as a foretelling of the future. You kind of imagine this person with long straggly hair and maybe a beard and raggedy clothes, and they're walking around talking about the end of the world coming, right? And specifically in the Bible, talking about all of these weird things that are going to happen that we tend to have in eschatological passages in the Bible, anything apocalyptic, right? Like Revelation or Daniel. But from a biblical point of view, prophecy is less about foretelling the future, and it's more about forthtelling. So foretelling would be telling beforehand something that's going to happen. Like if I said, you're going to have a winning lottery ticket today and you got it, that's foretelling prophecy. But in the biblical mindset, it's more forthtelling, a telling forth of something. So the biblical portrait of prophecy is less about saying this specific thing is going to happen at this specific time in the future. And it's more about saying, look at what's around us. Look at the culture right now. Look at the trajectory of where we are going as a people. And if we don't change, it's going to lead us to X place. We don't want to end up in X place. We want to end up in Y place. So we need to change something now, or else this trajectory that we're on is going to take us somewhere we don't want to go. Now, that's not to say that there is never any type of foretelling of future events in biblical prophecy. But just think with me. In our English Bibles, we have an entire section of our Old Testaments dedicated to prophecy, right? We call them the major prophets and the minor prophets. And they encompass roughly around 15-ish books. We have the 12, we call them minor prophets, just because of their size, they're shorter writings. And then you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, oftentimes Lamentations gets thrown in there as well, Ezekiel, and many times in English, Daniel as well, although, interestingly enough, Daniel is not really considered a prophetic book in the Hebrew scriptures. Kind of funny, since it's so apocalyptic in much of the storyline. And since it was their book long before it was ours, I kind of think we should give a little weight to their opinion more than ours, but that's just me. Regardless, think about those 15-ish books that we have in there. Now, I realize they are not frequently read as a whole. Even the shorter ones are not often read because they tend to just have a lot of really funky passages in them. The prophets are hard reading, particularly if you're using an older translation like the King James, but even in more modern English translations, they can be really hard to read. But if you do sit down and read these prophets and you can make your way through some of the drudgery and repetition, you would start to realize that a lot of what they're writing about is not foretelling of future events, but rather this forthtelling of the issues that are happening in their day right then and there. And the little bit that they do foretell is still just within a generation or two. And that's because the biblical idea of prophecy is not so much a God given knowledge of secret future events, but rather a God given intuition to understand the trajectory of the times that we live in and what needs to change in order to get to a better future. That's what prophecy in the Bible is more so about. So then when we talk about prophecy being fulfilled, that is also going to take on a little bit of a different meaning once we realize that prophecy itself isn't about the secret knowledge of future events that get shared with us. If prophecy is less about a secret God given knowledge of future events and more so about a God given intuition and understanding and discernment of the times that we live in and what needs to change for a better future, then fulfillment of prophecy is less about some miraculous conjugation of events that is mathematically implausible or even impossible, and it's more about somebody who, much like the prophets themselves, was able to discern both the past, what the prophets said, their present, to see if the words of the prophet have been heeded or not, and then they are able to take that in the present time and live their life accordingly to try to bring about a better way. Tim Mackey from Bible Project often translates fulfilled as fill full. And I really like how he just reverses the word there because fulfillment just has so much churchy baggage. Like if you came from any kind of evangelical or fundamentalist church, you just hear that word fulfillment or prophecy, and you have so much that is just inherently going to enter your brain with that, so much baggage it brings along. So to say fill full instead of fulfill, it kind of gets us thinking more so about what the word actually means rather than just what we think it means. So I might borrow that a little bit through the conversation here today, that we're going to talk about what fills full a prophecy. The word often used in the New Testament is plerao, and it's used of filling something to the point of overflowing. It can also mean to satisfy or appease demands. It can mean to pay something in full. And I kind of like that understanding of it. Like, I realize a dictionary definition is not sufficient to tell you what a word means. That just tells you what a word could mean in any given situation. We can't just take the sum of all of the dictionary definitions, add them together, and say, here's what the word means. We have to look at the context to determine what it could mean in this particular case. But I kind of like that idea of, like, this is paid in full. There is no more debt here. And I almost see, particularly Matthew, we're going to talk about why Matthew in a second, but I kind of imagine that's how they view fulfilling or filling full prophecy. It's almost like he's early to the game here in the Christianity movement, and he goes, I want to hop on this and claim these passages for my own so that no one else can come along and say, oh yeah, these passages in the Hebrew scriptures, they were prophesying about this Messiah that we're talking about over here. Matthew's saying, no, I'm already claiming these for mine. It's now paid in full. This is now fulfilled. This is filled full. You can't claim this verse. I claimed it for my Messiah over here. Like, he's moving in on the real estate quickly. So, maybe that doesn't do anything for you. For me, as I was doing the study, I thought that was kind of a helpful way of viewing it. So I mentioned just a second ago that this is specifically in regards to Matthew. So, quick reminder, in our New Testaments, we only have 2 accounts of Jesus' birth. We have 4 Gospels, but only 2 of them actually mention a birth, and that is Matthew and Luke. Mark has no mention of it. John really doesn't have any mention of it. He kind of tries to one-up all the others and place Jesus' origin at the very beginning of time, but that's a whole other story for another day. We'll touch on Luke a little bit in the second half of the episode, but our main focus is going to be on Matthew, because Matthew is very interested in presenting Jesus as the one who fills full prophecy from his Hebrew scriptures. Matthew is an expert in Hebrew scriptures. He knew them inside and out, and he's trying to present this underdog, crucified by the state, no-name rabbi from a backwater town as the fulfillment, as the one to fill full the Jewish story. So he's working with a severe disadvantage here. Jesus was a small town guy whose ministry seems to have only lasted for 1 to 3-ish years, depending on which gospel you're reading. And then he was killed by the state. Like, that doesn't really sound like the kind of person that you would say is the champion of our people that we have been looking for that's going to change the world. So, in order to convince his Jewish listeners that Jesus is worth the time of day to listen to this story, Matthew draws very heavily on their scriptures, and he starts tying key passages of scripture. They're not random, they're very specifically chosen. He ties those to Jesus. Now, whether or not they were about Jesus in the first place is a matter that we're going to get to in the next several minutes. But Matthew finds meaning in them for the story that he is trying to tell. And I realize the way I'm presenting this may make some of you uncomfortable, particularly if you came from a fundamentalist background like I did, because we tended to have the idea that God just supervised the entire writing of the Bible to the point that it's verbatim exactly what he wanted, basically no personality of the humans involved whatsoever. And so God orchestrates every little detail of this. It borders on a Calvinist view of sovereignty of God, particularly when we start talking about prophecy and how much God would have had to have forced to happen exactly a particular way. It almost removes free will. We don't like to think of it that way, but the more you start to think of prophecy the way we tend to, it really is God forcing humans to do certain things just to match up with a text. So again, I am not trying to detract from the Bible. I am actually trying to elevate the Bible and say, let's just look at the message that it has and not the message that we have tacked onto it. Let's just let it tell the story that it's trying to. And if that changes the way that we see these passages, that's not the fault of the Bible, and that's not me trying to tear down your faith. That's the fault of our misrepresented ways of presenting the passages over time. So before you pick up stones and try to stone me for teaching context over tradition, let me just show you the way that Matthew handles Scripture. If you had a pastor come into your church and the way he preached the Bible was the way that Matthew handles his Scriptures, you would never invite him back, because he is ripping these texts out of context and making them say what he wants them to say rather than what they actually said. When we were in college, we learned two key words for Bible interpretation that are way too nerdy, but I'll share them here. Eisegesis and exegesis. Exegesis means that you are trying to draw out of the text the meaning that is there. Eisegesis means you are trying to read into the text your own ideas. So ideally, good preaching is exegesis, drawing out what is in the text. Bad preaching would be eisegesis, reading your own opinions into the text. Matthew would fail exegesis class for committing eisegesis, for reading in what he wants it to say. And yet, that is in our Bibles, that is in our New Testaments, that is in our very first chapter of the New Testament. Now, what exactly that means for good Bible interpretation, what we should do with that, that's a conversation for another day that I definitely hope to have on the podcast. But let me just show you a little bit of how Matthew uses the Hebrew text that he has, and I think it will help to enlighten the rest of our study here. Let's begin just by talking about Matthew chapter 1. It opens with a genealogy, which is nobody's favorite part of Scripture, but if you've listened to our podcast for a little while, you know there is more in the genealogies than you might think at first, and there's actually some really awesome stuff we can draw from there. Last Christmas, we talked a little bit about the genealogies in Matthew and Luke, so you can go to those pages for our episodes and for more resources about the genealogies. I don't have time to get back into them in enough detail here today. We're just going to kind of glance over it as we talk. In particular, I want to look at Matthew 1:17. This is the end of the list. Matthew has now listed all of these people, starting with Abraham, going up to Jesus. And in verse 17, he says, "So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David until the carrying away into Babylon," that's the exile, "are 14 generations, and from the carrying away into Babylon unto Christ are 14 generations." Most of us gloss completely over all of that because it is 17 verses of names that nobody can pronounce. But if you believe that the Bible is always truthful and is easy to understand and fully guided by God to be always true in every little detail, then you can't skip over this verse, because this verse has some major issues. For starters, let's do some simple math. Matthew says, from Abraham to David, there are 14 generations. From David to the exile, another 14 generations. And then from the exile until the birth of Jesus, another 14 generations. You do a little bit of math, 14 plus 14 plus 14 equals 42. But if you were to count up each of the names that he mentions in the genealogy, he only gives 41. That's right. 41. You can count them. Trust me, I already did. There are other people who have as well, so you can do a Google search. You can check me. Or if you want, you can do like I did, copy and paste, put each one on a numbered line, and you get 41. So right here, 17 verses into the New Testament, we have a lie. Question mark. Maybe. Ishly. Possibly. Not quite. Was Matthew just really bad at math? Or did he have something bigger at play here? Well, I would argue that he definitely has a bigger goal going on. But if you're just going off of the idea that the Bible should be easy to understand and always true and have no spin to it whatsoever, there is nothing that didn't happen exactly the way that it's presented, well, then this puts a little bit of a wrench in your gear, because you have to really dig and count. Like, you have to take the time to count each of these names to realize that Matthew is telling you something that isn't entirely true right off the bat. He only gives 41 generations when he tells you he gives 42. And I'll explain some theories on why that is in just a second. I want to point out another problem first, though. We have a handful of genealogies in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, and many of them center on the line of David, because that's kind of the family that is at the center of much of the biblical story, at least, leading up to David and then branching out forth from David. And so we have genealogical records going up to Zerubbabel that is mentioned in verse 13. Now, from Abiud down through Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, we don't have any record of that genealogy. So we don't know where Matthew got those names and that part of the story. But we do have up until Zerubbabel. So we don't have a way of verifying the last, roughly 10-ish people in the genealogy. But we can go back through our Old Testament genealogies and verify up through Zerubbabel. And what we find is Matthew has left off genealogies. In his effort to try to present to us a clean 14, 14, 14, he has specifically, purposefully, I would argue, left out certain names from his genealogy. Now, I suppose you could say that maybe he was working off of manuscripts or from memory that didn't have the entire list. I mean, I don't think he had this whole genealogy memorized, so I don't think it was memory. I think he was probably working off of some texts. And I guess you could say maybe there was the possibility the ones he was working with were missing generations, but I don't think so. I think that he very purposefully structured this to get across his 14, 14, 14. And either way, if you're coming at the Bible with this idea that it's security camera footage of exactly what happened, either one of those options should make you uncomfortable, because that either means that Matthew changed the presentation of the text, or it means that he was working off of a flawed text, and God was apparently okay with that for our New Testament. So neither one fits in well with this standard view a lot of evangelicals and fundamentalists have of the Bible being like security camera footage of what exactly happened. Now, please understand, I am by no means saying that the Bible is not true or that these stories didn't happen. What I am saying is that God apparently allowed the authors to present the text with a little bit of spin, trying to tell them as theological histories, with the emphasis on theological. The theology is driving the narrative telling of the story. And this gets into why Matthew presented Jesus' lineage as having 3 groups of 14, even though we know factually that it did not from the Old Testament genealogies, and we also know that he only lists 41 people. Here's why he did that. Matthew is very interested in presenting Jesus both as a new David and as a new Moses, 2 of the most key figures in Israelite history. And so, for example, with Moses, just a few chapters into the story, we have Jesus ascending a mountain and giving a new law to his people. That sounds like Moses on Mount Sinai. With David coming from Bethlehem and being a shepherd, we have Jesus coming from Bethlehem and speaking of shepherding the people. Well, in certain Jewish circles, there is a practice called gematria. This goes back to early Hebrew did not have numbers. They didn't have numerals. So the letters stood in for the numbers. So like Aleph being the first, that would be one. Bet being the second, that would be number two, that sort of thing. And so it created this practice where you could have a numerical value for certain words. It's almost like binary code in a way if you're into computer nerdiness. Gematria is real. It is absolutely practiced by some of the biblical authors, and it often gives just little hidden hyperlinks and cool literary nuggets to the story. As time went on and you get more into Kabbalistic traditions of Jewish mysticism, Gematria can end up being used in really weird ways. And like if you look into Gematria online, I know I've mentioned this on the podcast before, I would just recommend you don't because you are going to end up in some very strange places very fast with very weird interpretations of scripture that I don't think are the best. But that is not to say that Gematria has no place whatsoever, because this is a perfect example of how the biblical authors actually used it to be meaningful in their telling of the story. If you were to add up the consonants of David's name using the English letters DVD, or in Hebrew, Dalet, Vav, Dalet, they are 4, 6, 4. Put together, 14. How many generations did Matthew say were in each grouping? 14. Remember, Matthew is trying to present Jesus as a new David. In fact, he mentions David quite a bit in this genealogy, more than any other figure. So he's kind of just giving us this little bread trail to almost subconsciously say, David, 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 David. Okay, through the whole thing. Like, keep your mind on David. Keep thinking of David when you're thinking about Jesus. Matthew also sometimes used alternative spellings of names in order to change the gematria of the list. Now, sometimes when you're taking a name from one language into a different language that uses a different alphabet, the spelling can be slightly different. Like we might have, say, a name in Russian that comes over into American English, and it might be spelled a couple of different ways. Or you know what? A great example of this is the word Hanukkah. How many different ways can we spell Hanukkah, right? Sometimes there's CH at the start. Sometimes it's just H. Sometimes you have an H on the end. Sometimes you don't. Yeah, there are different ways that you can spell the word, and it still is Hanukkah. So this can happen in biblical names as well, where sometimes the spelling of the name is slightly different. And Matthew chose specific spellings of some of the names in order to add up to a different amount. Now, I will say right off the bat here, I am relying heavily on J. Richard Middleton's article on Biologos, Matthew's Genealogy of Jesus, Part 1. He took the time to count this up. I have not. So, Middleton is a reputable scholar, so I don't think we have too much concern here. But, just putting the disclaimer up there that I have not taken the time to count out the gematria for each of these names. Well, supposedly, if you take the gematria, the numerical value for each of the 14 names in the first set, going from Abraham up until David, using the alternate spellings that Matthew has proposed, you get 574, which Abraham's numerical value is 41, and the gematria for David is 14. If you take 41 and multiply it by 14, you get 574. Similarly, if you take the list of 14 from David to the exile, the gematria is 560, which is David, 14, and then the last king listed there, Jeconiah, whose gematria is 40. You take 14 times 40, you get 560. And all of that is really weird nerdiness that maybe some of you are enjoying and maybe some of you are going, all right, yawn, what's the big deal? Well, it helps to explain the missing generation in the third set. Because the first set has 14, the second set has 14, the third set is the one that falls short with only 13. Remember, we're supposed to have 42 according to what Matthew said, but we only have 41. So if we look back at verse 16, this is the end of the genealogy. Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Well, if you try to figure out the addition of the gematria from the time of the exile to Jesus, you end up with a sum of 546, which Middleton says is not significant in any discernible way. However, if you take note of the fact that the verse ends with Jesus, who is called Messiah, and you realize we're missing a generation there, Middleton suggests that we should treat Messiah as the 14th name in the third set. Even though Messiah is not a name, it's a title, and you could say, well, that's not really another generation. Maybe that's the point. maybe Matthew is trying to draw extra special attention to Jesus, hoping that his readers would catch there's one missing and it's right at Jesus. So you start to then focus on this Jesus. And if you take that word Messiah, the gematria, the numerical value for it, is 42. Well, what number are we missing out of 42? 42. And then if you add that 42 into the sum of the gematria for this list, so now we have 14 instead of 13, you end up with a total of 588. And David's gematria, 14, times Messiah, 42, is 588. So David is being put at the forefront again, and it seems to suggest then that this Messiah figure that they've been looking for is a new David. And who is this new David? Well, the last person in the list, Jesus. Oh, and to top it all off, Middleton also mentions that if you add up the gematria from each set, 574 in the first one, 560 in the second, 588 in the third, it totals 1,722, which is the number you get when you multiply the gematria of Abraham, 41, times Messiah, 42. You get 1,722. I realize that is a lot to take in, and it's probably a bit much to hear it. It might be better to see it in front of you. So I would definitely recommend checking out Middleton's article on Biologos called Matthew's Genealogy of Jesus. There were, I think, 4 different parts to it, if I remember correctly. It is a helpful article, and we link to that, I think, in last year's show notes, and I probably will in this year as well. But I didn't just take you on that excursion to get nerdy with numbers. I wanted to show you that Matthew is willing to play a little fast and loose with his historical record in order to prove a theological point. For him, the importance is not the letter of the law, but rather the meaning behind it. He's less interested in giving you video camera footage of history and more interested in shining a spotlight through specifically crafted details on this person of Jesus. So when Matthew starts talking about prophecies being fulfilled, we shouldn't expect this extreme literalistic fundamentalist reading that a lot of preachers give. We should be expecting him to be taking texts that meant something in their own context and changing it ever so slightly to apply to his particular message. That should not surprise us. Now, whether or not it concerns us or causes a crisis of faith, that's another matter. Yeah, I'm joking a little bit, but it is a hard hurdle for a lot of Christians to jump over once they start considering the ways that the New Testament writers used Scripture. And if you believe they were inspired, if you believe that God had any hand in preserving this text, that means that apparently he was okay with them using the texts this way, in ways that we would not be comfortable using them. And again, that's a whole other discussion for another day, but I don't think that's something that needs to ruin our faith. I think it's something that can and should challenge our faith and broaden our faith to realize that maybe our definitions and understandings of Scripture are a little too narrow, but it doesn't necessarily have to ruin our faith, especially since this is the very first generation of our faith and they did it this way. Like, who are we to come along and say they got it wrong when these were people who lived in the same generation as Jesus? So I think we just need to put some of our modern arrogance aside that assumes we have the right way of doing this and just listen and learn from the text. So as you read the gospel according to Matthew, you are going to find 10 different times that he presents Jesus as the fulfillment of a Hebrew scripture just within the first 4-ish chapters. Now, the way people count it is a little bit different because there are technically 7 times in the first 4 chapters that he specifically says are fulfilled prophecies or filled full prophecies. But then there's a couple other times that he adds in quotations where he doesn't necessarily say they were fulfilled, but that's the difference between a direct quote and an allusion. I'm just going to deal with the direct quotes. I am also going to only focus on the story of Jesus' birth here. So I'm not going to get to all 7 or all 10 or however you want to count them exactly. I'm just going to focus on the roughly 5 that all take place in Matthew 1 through 2. And I have to say, I never actually realized how much Matthew relies on this format of trying to make a connection with the Hebrew Scriptures to his current story with Jesus until I was doing this study. Because at Christmas, we usually focus on Luke's account. We kind of mesh the two together. But just reading Matthew on its own, I kept seeing over and over again how frequently he was referring back to old prophecies as being filled full in Jesus. So let's get looking at those now. First one on the list is Matthew 1:22-23. Now all this was done that might be fulfilled, or filled full, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Behold, a virgin will be with child, and will bring forth a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, which being interpreted is God with us. Now, if you have a study Bible, you might see a cross-reference here that takes you back to the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, and specifically chapter 17, verse 14, as what Matthew is drawing on here. So let's read Isaiah 7:14 and see how the original passage compares to what Matthew is saying the passage is and what he is saying it means, because there's going to be differences in both of those cases. So Isaiah 7:14 reads, Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and will call his name Emmanuel. So there are some slight differences here. Matthew's account says, Behold, a virgin will be with child. So that's different than Isaiah's. Behold, a virgin will conceive and bring forth a son and bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, and she shall call his name Emmanuel. And then Matthew tacks on the interpretation is God with us. That is the meaning of the Hebrew words Immanuel. And that name that we say as Emmanuel, it's actually two words in Hebrew, and it's kind of a contraction and another word. So it's like three words almost. You have the Hebrew preposition im, which is with, nu, which is a suffix that gets added on to the end of a word, and that means us, and then the word for God, el. So it's actually, if you were just reading it in Hebrew, imanu, second word, then el. Imanu el. And it gets anglicized as Emmanuel. But it literally means with us God, or God with us. So that's why Matthew throws in that explainer there. One key difference we can notice just by being eagle-eyed viewers of our English translations is that Matthew changes who calls the child Emmanuel. The original passage in Isaiah says, she shall call his name Emmanuel. Although technically if you're reading in King James it just says, and shall call his name Emmanuel, but you can pretty easily trace the subject back to the virgin there, that she shall call his name Emmanuel. Matthew, on the other hand, says, they shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, many of you are probably going, okay, does that really make any difference? Not necessarily, but if you are the kind of fundamentalist that wants to take the Bible very literally and have every little word be exact, then you should be concerned over something as simple as the difference between a she and a they. Like, I remember growing up and hearing that, the Bible is inspired down to the very letters, and sometimes people would even say the punctuation marks, which is absolutely a misunderstanding of how the Bible came to be. You can check out our From Scroll to Screen series for more on that. But here we go again with Matthew playing a little fast and loose in who calls the child Emmanuel. Is it a singular she, as in the original prophecy or passage, or is it this plural they that's in Matthew's account? Regardless of which one you think is accurate, I actually kind of find it amusing that there's this statement of the child will be called Emmanuel, and yet Jesus is never called Emmanuel. This is literally the only time the name Emmanuel shows up in the New Testament, is this one single verse in Matthew 1:23. There is no other passage, not in the rest of the Gospels, not in Paul's letters, nothing. It's in our hymns, it's in our sermons, but it's not in the rest of the Bible. So they talk about the child being called Emmanuel, and he never is in the rest of the scriptures. Now, is it possible that maybe that was a nickname or a middle name or a secondary name that Jesus had that some people called and it just didn't make into the Bible? Yeah, I guess it's possible. I think we also have to understand that naming in the Bible was very significant, and it was also very ceremonial. Like today, you don't necessarily choose a baby name based on its meaning. Some people do, but some people just go off of, they like the way a name sounds, and they don't really care about what it would have meant. Whereas back then, it was much more this ceremonial, like, even if someone doesn't necessarily call you this new name, it's signifying what your life is going to be like. There was kind of this idea in the ancient world, and even in some cultures today, that what you name a child is going to have some bearing on the type of person that they become. Now, personally, looking at the psychology of that, I wonder if that's more just on the way the parents then treat them based on the name and the expectations that they have for the child based on the name, rather than actually prophesying what the kid's life is going to be about. It's more just the parents' expectations based on the name they gave, but that's a whole other matter. So I don't think that we have to read these passages as saying that this had to be an actual name of Jesus as much as like an honorific that is being given at his birth. But as we move past the English into the actual Hebrew and Greek of these passages, we start getting into more and more hiccups because a lot of English versions, the King James especially, and even many modern versions, they will sometimes colorfully translate Old Testament passages that are seen as prophecies of Jesus so that they more closely match the way they're presented in the New Testament. Now, I want to be very, very careful not to erode someone's confidence in their English Bibles. I don't ever want to present as if you have to read Greek and Hebrew to know what the Bible really says. Absolutely not. Almost every major English translation that we have out there today is reliable, and I would confidently say you have the Bible, you have God's words in your hands. But every translation has a bias, and since most Bibles are translated by Christians, a lot of these translators are trying to get across the idea that Jesus is the focus of these texts, which doesn't sound like a bad thing, but once you have a precedent for a particular verse that makes it popular, it's really hard to change that. Like the majority of versions out there are going to read pretty darn similar in John 3:16, just because we are so used to the way it has been presented to us in English that to change it too much would really upset people. So there is a pragmatism to certain translations, and particularly when we're dealing with passages that have been presented as prophecies of Jesus, there's definitely some spin that gets put in the translation. And this verse right here, Isaiah 7:14, it's a perfect example of it. The King James, just like a lot of English translations, I don't want to say they changed the meaning of Isaiah 7:14, but they kind of back translated it. They went in with the assumption that we have to go with what Matthew says this passage meant. And so, in order to prevent Christians having any kind of confusion, when they see the little footnote that says, hey, this is a quote of Isaiah 7:14, and then they go check Isaiah 7:14 and it's different than Matthew's translation of it. In order to avoid that, we're just going to present Isaiah 7:14 closer to the way Matthew puts it than maybe what it originally would have been. So let me just give you a little bit more of a true Hebrew translation of Isaiah 7:14. It would read like this: Therefore, Adonai himself will give you an ensign. Look at the young pregnant woman. She will birth a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. Let me read the King James one more time so you get back to back. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Versus my translation of the Hebrew. Therefore Adonai himself will give you an ensign. Look at this young pregnant woman. She will birth a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. So you can hopefully see some differences here, where the King James and many English translations after it have altered their translation to match what is expected based on Matthew's interpretation. However, we have to remember, these are ancient texts. Even by Matthew's time, they were several hundred years old, so they meant something for those several hundred years before Matthew reinterpreted them. Let's talk about some of the differences. In the first place, in Isaiah, the woman is already pregnant. She is not a virgin. You probably caught that when I said, look at the young pregnant woman. I did not say look at the virgin. That is not my bringing some liberal bias to the Bible and trying to remove the virgin birth of Jesus. I promise you. It's just trying to be faithful to the Hebrew word used in the text. Because Hebrew has a couple of different words that can be used for a young woman. One in particular that tends to mean virgin more so, and that's betulah. And then one that just means a young woman. She could be married. She could have kids. She doesn't necessarily have to be a virgin. And that's alma. And you want to guess which one's used here? It's not betulah. It's not the word that's usually virgin. It's the word that just means young woman. It's alma. And in fact, we can even tell from the context here, just looking at this verse itself, she could not be a virgin because she is already pregnant here in this story. God says to Isaiah, look at the young pregnant woman. Again, I'm not changing anything in the text here. It does not say virgin. That is not the word. It is just the word for young woman. Now, could Alma also include a woman who was a virgin? Yes, but not necessarily does it have to. And particularly when you realize that the text is already telling you she's pregnant. Also, notice how God tells Isaiah, look at her. He doesn't show him some vision 500 plus years into the future. He's saying, look over there. Do you see that woman who is very obviously pregnant? Not the most tactful way to put it, but I guess when you're God, you can get away with saying that sort of thing. So he is showing Isaiah something that is right there in front of him. And before some of you are going, well, maybe it was a vision. How do you know it wasn't? Well, let's look at the rest of the passage in Isaiah 7. Butter and honey will he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that you abhor will be forsaken of both of her kings. See, this is where we have to go back to the very beginning of the chapter, chapter 7. I realize this is not as much fun as just pulling a verse out of context and saying it means whatever we want it to say. This is hard work, but this is how good Bible study is done. You have to go back and see what's actually being talked about. And this is only a few verses back. Chapter 7, verse 1, we see that the king of Judah is being attacked by this confederation of the king of Israel and the king of Syria, and he is worried that they are going to destroy him and his people. So God gives him this, a lot of times we'll say sign. I chose the word ensign because it's actually the word for a military banner. Like, you would have a flag flying in your camp. God is saying this is going to be a sign, an ensign, a banner to show you exactly, like there is no doubt. You see that banner, you know which army is coming. There is no doubt when you see this sign that things are going to go the way that I have said they're going to go. And what he says is that by the time the child is old enough to know the difference between good and evil, these two kings that you are so worried about, they are going to be completely off your radar. You will not have to worry about them at all. They'll be gone. You'll just be on your own. Now, Isaiah is usually believed to have ministered about 700-ish years before Jesus. So, we can go back and forth on exactly how old a child needs to be before they can know the difference between good and evil. But I can tell you one thing for sure, it ain't 700 years. This was not a prophecy of Jesus' birth. This was a statement to a very real king at a very real time, 700 years before Jesus, that said, hey, you're worried about these invading nations. You see that pregnant woman? By the time she has given birth and the kid is old enough to know the difference between good and evil, those nations will be gone. You don't have to worry about them anymore. So, if she was far enough along that you could tell she was pregnant, let's say you needed, I don't know, let's just say she was halfway through. So you need another roughly 4 months for the pregnancy. And then, let's give the benefit of the doubt and say it takes 5 years for the kid to know the difference between good and evil. In less than 6 years, all of this is going to come to pass and these nations are going to be gone. The prophecy was not for 600 years into the future. It was for less than 6 years into the future. And so now we circle back to the idea of her being a young woman instead of a virgin. If you believe that the word should be virgin, then that means you should think there was a second virgin birth, not just for Jesus, but also for this woman 700 years before Jesus. And I don't really know any Christians that are willing to say that. So this was not a prophecy for centuries into the future for when someone named Jesus was going to be born. Notice that there is no name Jesus here. The child was going to be called Immanuel. And that was apparently an actual kid that was born in the royal court. His name would have been Immanuel. And in fact, that name, Immanuel, it only shows up one other time outside of Isaiah 7 and Matthew 1, and that's Isaiah 8. Isaiah 8:8 reads, "And he will pass through Judah, he will overflow and go over, he will reach even to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings will fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel." So this is speaking now to this Emmanuel. Just one chapter later, enough time has passed that Emmanuel is old enough for God to be speaking directly to him. Now, we don't really know who that character is in the biblical story. We're not given any other details. Now, I'm about to say a name. It's going to sound like I am being possessed by demons. I promise I am not, at least not that I am aware of. This is actually the longest name in the Hebrew Bible. So if any of you out there are looking for baby names, here's a classic one. You ready? Maher Shalal Chashbaz. That's the longest name in the entirety of the Bible. I think I said Hebrew Bible. It's actually the whole Bible. Longest name. Maher Shalal Chashbaz. He is another enigmatic character in Isaiah's writings. Some people think that this character was Isaiah's child. Some think Hezekiah may have actually been this Maher Shalal Chashbaz. Others think that maybe this Immanuel is the same person as We'll just call him M for short, so I don't have to keep saying that. So we don't really know much of anything about either of these characters. But we do know that they played a role in their own story 700 years before Jesus. And no one was reading these passages in those 700 years and thinking, oh yeah, there's got to still be some future fulfillment to these. Like, no, they were very obviously fulfilled within those few years within Isaiah's lifetime there, several centuries before Jesus. Now, in the time between the Second Temple period, when we have the Hebrew scriptures being translated into Greek, and they get to this passage, they choose the Greek word parthenos to translate Alma, the word for maiden. And you'll often hear scholars say that Parthenos always means virgin. And so Matthew was probably reading the Greek Septuagint. He came across this rendering of Parthenos and thought, oh, it must have been virgin. So, this fits with my story of Jesus being virgin born. However, even that doesn't quite work because Matthew was a smart reader. I mean, look at all the stuff we just said in the last several minutes that he put into a genealogy of all things. He would not have read this story in Isaiah that he is referencing and thought that the woman mentioned there was a virgin. In fact, despite what many scholars seem to say, Parthenos does not always have to mean virgin in Greek. In fact, if you were reading the Septuagint Greek of Genesis, going all the way back to chapter 34, we have this awful story of Jacob has his 12 sons. He also had some daughters, and one of them is mentioned named Dinah, or often said Dinah in English, and she is raped by a tribesman in the local area. After this happens, she is called what the King James says is a damsel in verse 3 of chapter 34. The Greek Septuagint translated that with Parthenos. This was after she had been raped by Shechem, and yet she was still called a Parthenos. So apparently, much like with the Hebrew Alma, Parthenos does not always have to mean virgin, but that is how Matthew wanted to present his version of the story. So I return to our question from the very beginning of the episode. What holds more truth? History or prophecy? Well, in Dune, the Bene Gesserit looked at their history and observed the present, and with that, they came up with prophecy that they would be able to find a way to fulfill in the future. And even with something like the prophecy that they fed into the Fremen's religion about the Kwisatz Haderach, so much of prophecy's fulfillment depends on your reading of it. There's a scene you might be familiar with if you've seen the Dune movies where Paul has a still suit, it's called. It's a full body outfit that conserves water since they were on a desert planet. And they're supposed to be done up in a certain way to prevent any moisture from leaking out of your body. It gets reused, like on the space station sort of thing. And Paul has it done up in a very particular way that shocks the Fremen, where they say, did somebody put this on for you? Or had you seen other people do this before? Because you tied this up in a very specific way. And he's like, no, it felt like the right way to do it. And then they go crazy saying, see, this is proof he is the Kwisatz Haderach. It fulfills prophecy. Well, the prophecy was not that he would know how to put on a particular outfit. The prophecy was he will know your ways. Well, that's pretty vague. And yes, knowing how to put on their outfit is a sign of knowing their ways, but there's plenty of other stuff about their ways that he didn't know, that even get evidence throughout the book and movie, like when he has to do this one-on-one duel that's to the death, and he doesn't realize at first that it's supposed to be to the death. So someone could have rightfully argued, maybe you aren't our Messiah. I thought you were supposed to know our ways. Why didn't you know this one? Like, it gets very selectively picked when we're talking about what fulfills prophecy. And that's kind of what Matthew is doing. Now, he, I don't think, has any of the malicious intent that the Bene Gesserit arguably do. I mean, that's a whole other rabbit hole for a Dune podcast and not a Bible podcast. But it's kind of this idea of, like, history has that truth. Like, this is what happened. But prophecy is what we make of that. We're able to look at our history. We're able to look at these texts that meant something back then. And I see in this text the story of Israel hurting. My people were hurting, just speaking from Matthew's point of view here. And they were looking for deliverance from an outside oppressive enemy. Well, here we are in our time being oppressed by Rome, and we want deliverance. And since God provided it back then, how might I present my current story in a way that lines up with that old story so that my listeners will hear that and think, oh, God is going to provide deliverance again here. That is the way that Matthew uses these texts to be filled full in Jesus. Not in the fulfillment of prophecy way that we tend to read it as modern Westerners, but rather it's just saying this is a fuller version of the story. This is like the sequel that you didn't know the story needed to have. But it's supposed to draw on your familiarity with the former story to make you more comfortable with this current story, and then maybe you can go back and find more meaning in the old story. It's kind of like legacy movies that we have today, like the new Star Wars sequels from the last 10 years, or the new Ghostbusters movies, or any of these things that have been super divisive, Indiana Jones even, where we start to take these old legacy characters. Scream did this too, right? They're taking the old legacy characters but meshing them with a new cast, trying to move the story forward while also drawing on your love for the old story to say, hey, if you love the old story, bring that love over to this new story, and that may or may not work. That's actually a pretty decent analogy because not everyone loved the way the New Testament was going, Just like some people think Star Wars should have stopped with 3 movies or 6 movies and not gone on to do more, there were some people at this time that thought, you know what? I think our scriptures are good where they're at. We don't need your new stories added on. But then there are others that go, yes, but it helps to fill out the lore, and it makes more sense of some of these characters. And sure, maybe there's some hard parts in it. I'm looking at you, Paul. But, maybe it adds more to our understanding of what came before. So that's very much what's going on with these biblical stories as well. All right, how are we feeling? I realize that is a lot to take in, and it can be overwhelming. So, please take care of yourselves. Let's pause for a minute, we'll stretch, take a quick break, and we'll come back and deal with the next instance of Matthew's drawing on text from the Hebrew Scriptures. And don't worry, we're going to speed it up a little bit as we go through these here. That first one was the longest one by far. So we'll take a quick break and reconvene in Matthew chapter 2. Matthew 2, beginning in verse 3. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where the Messiah should be born. And they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it was written by the prophet, And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least amongst the princes of Judah, for out of thee will come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Just like with last time, let's look at the actual reference and see how they are similar and how they are different. This is in reference to Micah chapter 5, verses 2 through 5, roughly. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet that out of thee will come forth unto me, who is to be a ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. You know what, I'm just going to stop right there at verse 2, because that's Matthew's quote. We'll deal with the context in a second here. So, relatively similar, but there are some differences here that aren't the easiest thing in the world to catch. For starters, let's just look at English. The King James translators played a little fast and loose with the meaning of the last verb in verse 6 of Matthew chapter 2. They read it as, who will rule my people Israel. However, that word rule there, it's based on the Greek word poimeno, which it can have the idea of leading or even ruling, but the definition of the word is actually to shepherd. You say, well, why would the King James translators have it as rule if the word means to shepherd? Well, they were trying to make it match Micah 5:2 exactly, because Micah 5:2 reads, out of you will come forth unto me one who is to be a ruler in Israel. And they thought, just like with the previous example, we have to try to make sure this is close enough that if someone goes back and checks, they're going to see similarity there. What I guess they just didn't realize is that Matthew was actually compiling a few different passages here and smushing them up into one quote-unquote prophecy. He was drawing not just on Micah 5:2, but also on Micah 5:4, which reads, he will stand and feed, and that's the Hebrew word for shepherding or feeding a flock, in the strength of the Lord. There also seems to be a little bit of 2 Samuel 5:2 thrown in there, which reads, also in the time past, when Saul was king over us, you were he who led us out and brought us in Israel, and the Lord said to you, you will feed my people Israel, and you will be a captain over Israel. So you can maybe see a little bit of that there, where Matthew reads, out of you will come a governor who will feed my people Israel. Well, given that 2 Samuel 5 is David's coronation, it would be no surprise to me if Matthew drew on that as well, since he is trying to connect Jesus to David so much here. Okay, so now we've looked at the difference between the original verse and Matthew's presentation of the verse, or really conglomeration of a few verses. Let's talk about what the original would have actually meant in its own context. But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you be little amongst the thousands of Judah, yet out of you will come forth to me he who is supposed to be a ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. Man, that sure sounds like Jesus, right? Well, there we go with that English translation again. Because a better way of putting this would be, you who are from Bethlehem of Ephratah are least among the clan of Judah. From you to me will come a ruler in Israel, whose origin is from old and from ancient times. See, the way that the English is translated here, it makes it out as if Bethlehem and Ephratah would have been a location more than likely near Bethlehem. We're not exactly sure on that. It's ambiguous a little bit in the Hebrew text where exactly Ephratah would be located. But the way the English has it, it's presenting Bethlehem Ephratah as the object of direct speech. God is speaking through Micah directly to them, but you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you be little. Well, that might not be the best way to translate it. If we're going back to the way Micah had it originally. Cities are usually feminine in Hebrew. Just like in English most of the time, if you name a boat, it's going to have a female name, right? Same idea with cities back then. Not necessarily that the name of the city was female, but just that it was treated as grammatically female in gender. It's a little weird in English, but if you've ever studied another language like Spanish that has gender in the words, same idea there. So cities are usually feminine in their grammatical gender, but the you that's used here is masculine. So it's more than likely actually saying, you who are from Bethlehem of Ephratah. So it's referring to a specific person who would have come from this area, and saying that you are least amongst the clans of Judah. Bethlehem was a very small city, even at the time of Jesus, not even a city, a very, very, very small village. And saying, from you to me will come a ruler in Israel whose origin is from old and from ancient times. See, this is again where knowing a little bit of the underlying language helps, because some translations will say, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. Now, I don't know how you read that. I would love to hear. Feel free to write in on our social media or send it an email, cconn@thebibleuncut.com. Let me know how you read that verse and what you thought it meant before. I know growing up in church, I always read that like goings forth, meaning his actions. Like he has been going forth working in the world since eternity. And so, of course, that's Jesus, the Son of God. But the word that's used there of his goings forth, it's motsa'ah. And it just means his origins. So it's saying that his origins are from ancient times. That means he came from an old family line. This was not necessarily a prophecy of the Son of God who was eternal being born in human flesh. It's saying that this person who is going to come from the line of David, because he's from Bethlehem, right? He's going to be a future ruler, but he's going to come from a long lineage. It's not going to be a new family, it's old blood. We have to realize ancient Jews weren't necessarily looking for one particular Messiah that was going to fix all of their problems for them, like we tend to see Jesus as being. The word Messiah just means anointed one, and there are several people throughout the biblical story who are messiahs. They are anointed ones. The priests were anointed. The kings were anointed. Even the pagan king, Cyrus the Great, is called a Messiah in the Bible. So it's not so much the idea of the one Messiah that's going to fix all of our problems, as much as a Messiah who is going to be an anointed one for our time, who is going to be someone who can bring us a little bit closer to Eden. And so there could be multiple messiahs all at the same time. I mean, you could have a king who was a messiah, an anointed one. At the same time, you had a priest who was a messiah, an anointed one. So we kind of have to also change our categories of what these people were looking for at that time. They weren't looking for the once-for-all savior that's going to completely change the world. It was more so like looking forward to the next leader for your people. And it only makes sense that a couple hundred years after David, dealing with several generations of crappy kings by this point, they would be looking for someone who would be just like David, somebody who would be a new David. So, of course, they're going to say it's going to originate from Bethlehem in an old lineage. They're tracing it back to David. I'm not sure if any scholars actually take this view, but there's also the point that the word old in Hebrew can actually mean east as well. So it was kind of the idea that in old times, in ancient times, way back when, we came from the east and moved west into where Israel is, from the perspective of the biblical authors. So old was then associated with the direction that we originally came from, east of them. Again, just from within their own perspective of the story. So it could also just be saying that this ruler would come from the east. It seems to more so be the idea of old, but since it mentions both old and ancient times, maybe it would be east and ancient lineage. Who knows? One thing we can be confident about, though, is that this was not seen as a prophecy that the Messiah had to be born in Bethlehem. So Matthew is very much presenting spin on his version of the story that he would have Jewish rabbis saying, oh yeah, our Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. Like, that is not the way that people would have viewed it back then. And here's why I say that with confidence. Bethlehem was a very, 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 very small village. If the ancient Jews were looking to Bethlehem as being the future birthplace of the Messiah, Bethlehem would not have been a very small village. It would have been a booming center for midwives. Everyone who ever had a child would want to go to Bethlehem to have the child born, because then it would increase the odds of that being the Messiah that they were looking for. But that never happened. That's not what happened. Like, if this was an obvious prophecy that, yes, our Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem, every birth would happen in Bethlehem. It would have been bigger than Jerusalem. And that's not what happened. Much like with Isaiah, if we do just a little bit of digging into the passage, it seems like what Micah was talking about is something that was right in his own lifetime. I think a lot of Christians, if they look back at Micah 5, they would want verses 4 and 5 to be about Jesus too. He will stand and feed in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. They will abide. From now he will be great until the ends of the earth. And this man shall be the peace, when the Assyrian shall come in our land, and when he will tread in our palaces, then we will rise again. And all of that sounds wonderful. That sounds like Jesus. Well, if that's the case, we also have to let verse 3 refer to him as well. Therefore will he give them up until the time that she which travails has brought forth, then the remnant of his brethren will return to the children of Israel. I realize that's kind of funky King James English, but this is very much like the Isaiah prophecy. Micah says, until the time she which travaileth has brought forth. So in other words, in the amount of time it takes for a woman to have a baby, this is going to happen. Well, at max, that's about 9 months. Certainly not several hundred years until Jesus comes around. So if you want to take verses 4 and 5 to be about Jesus, you also have to then say that he came to earth hundreds of years before he actually did. See, this was talking about people in Micah's own time. And Matthew is then seeing that, and just like with the Star Wars sequels, saying, here's a story you know and love, here's my new story, let's connect these together so hopefully you bring some of that nostalgia over with you to your idea of my story. That's not really how other Jewish people from his time would have read it. They were not looking at Micah 5 and saying, oh, there's going to be an eternal Messiah that will take on human flesh. No, even the part that talks about being from old, from, as the English said, from everlasting, that exact same word is translated usually, even in the King James, as former years or just past time, saying it's supposed to be in the past. I can take you to Malachi 3:4, where the exact same word is used and it's translated as in former years. Then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto the Lord, as in the days of old, as in former years. The King James translators knew better than to say everlasting there, because Jerusalem hasn't been around forever. It wouldn't make sense to say that people will bring offerings to Judah and Jerusalem that will be pleasant, just like they used to in eternity. No, that doesn't make any sense. But they wanted to put that in here where they interpreted this verse as talking about Jesus. See, the historical story has a lot of power, but if you can turn it into a prophecy, it's a lot more powerful. Next up, we just have to go a couple verses down. Matthew 2:13-15. When they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, and take the young child and his mother, flee into Egypt, and be there until I bring you word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night, and departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. I think this is the easiest example of Matthew's using a passage from the Tanakh to see how he changed it or how he reinterpreted it to mean something other than what it clearly originally meant. Because if you just go back to what he is referencing here, this is a very short quotation, Out of Egypt have I called my son. It takes you back to Hosea 11:1. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. Okay, you don't need to read any further than that first verse to see it's not talking about some person named Jesus who would live hundreds of years later and have to leave Egypt at some point. No, it very specifically says right there in the verse, when Israel was a child, in other words, when the nation of Israel was young, still, only a couple hundred people, then I loved them and called my son out of Egypt. So God is calling the entire nation of Israel his child and saying, I took them out of Egypt. But Matthew then takes something referring to the nation as a whole, as a person, and transports that or transposes that onto the person of Jesus. So he is trying to set you up to see Jesus as the ideal Israelite, as a new Israel. So Jesus now almost represents the entirety of the nation of Israel, as just a couple chapters later, he's going to wander in the wilderness for 40 days, just like 40 years for Israel. He's going to be tempted several times there, just like they were. He's going to cross over the Jordan River to be baptized, just like they crossed over the Jordan River into the land. And then he is going to have a new law, a new Torah, if you will, given on a mountain, just like with Moses. And on top of that, so much of Hosea is explicitly looking for a new David. We don't have time to go through all the examples right now, but you can just read through the book of Hosea and you can pretty easily see that they are longing for somebody just like David, and it's often just spoken of as the return of David, not meaning that David himself is going to come down from heaven and rule again, but it's going to be someone in the spirit of David, if you will, somebody just like them. Like, if we had this political figure that somehow everyone in America could agree upon was the best to be our next president, it might be like having a new George Washington here that, we elected unanimously. So it's kind of that same idea, like this person that we are hoping will come along, that the more we talk about it, the more we're hoping that will manifest it into being. They're going to be David. They're going to be just like David. And Matthew is no idiot. He is choosing these passages very purposefully so that you get the idea, that person, yeah, that's this guy I'm talking about, named Jesus. But again, that's not how anyone back then would have been reading Hosea 11. And I know some Christians that want to say, oh, well, these prophecies just have a dual meaning. They meant something to the original's audience, and there was also a secondary meaning that they didn't realize that we now realize. First off, that's kind of arrogant to think that we know better than them, and also that we now have the complete fulfillment. Isn't that convenient that we have the final answer and, there wasn't anything that we could have possibly gotten wrong. But also, like, the very context of this passage is not something that you can faithfully use of Jesus unless you are literally just pulling out that one little piece of verse 1 of Hosea 11. Because if you literally just go to the next sentence in Hosea 11:2, as they called them, so they went from them. They sacrificed to Baalim and burned incense to graven images. So this image of Israel being called as God's son out of Egypt is immediately followed up by saying they sacrificed to pagan gods. So if that's the image being used for Jesus, you can't just pick out one little snippet of a few words at the end of verse 1 without seeing the context that talks about the sin of following after pagan gods in verse 2. Matthew is being very intentional about the point he wants to get across, even when it means he is picking and choosing so that his version of the story matches what he wants to tell, where the part that he just barely left off would have not at all gone along with what he was saying. Not exactly good modern Bible interpretation, but things were a little different back then. Next up is verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying, In Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation and weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted, because they are not. As before, let's go straight to the Old Testament verse referenced. That's Jeremiah 31:15. Thus saith the Lord, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping, Rahel weeping for her children, refused to be comforted for her children, because they were not. First thing I'll point out is that it's actually a little weird the King James went for Rahel here, because it is referring to Rachel. It is the same spelling as Rachel that is translated Rachel in Genesis, but they left off the C here and just went with Rahel, which, I mean, in Hebrew, it would be pronounced Rachel anyway, almost more like Raquel that we have in English, but just interesting that they went for a slightly different spelling for the same person in this particular verse. It's literally the only time out of almost 50 times her name shows up in the Tanakh that the King James translators chose to do it differently, so who knows. Now, a couple examples back, we talked about how Matthew combined more than one passage into what he considered to be one single prophecy. Here, he is referencing Jeremiah 31:15, which itself combines a couple of passages together, because there was no passage in Genesis where the character of Rachel cries over the loss of her children. Rachel was one of Jacob's wives in Genesis, and just like Jacob is seen as the father of Israel, he had his name changed to Israel, hence why the people group is called Israel. Rachel is then kind of the matriarch of Israel, not mentioned nearly as much because, patriarchal culture and all that, but since her husband was the patriarch for Israel, she would be seen as the matriarch. So when it talks about her weeping for her children, it's not referencing a specific story from Genesis where she had a child die. It's referencing her crying in childbirth, which she would actually end up dying in childbirth in Genesis 35, which just so happened to take place near Bethlehem, combining that language with the language of Jacob's inconsolability over Joseph when he thought that he had lost Joseph to a wild animal when the brothers sold him into slavery, dipped the coat in an animal blood, and gave it back to Jacob. Messed up family, man. But Jeremiah is combining those two stories and the language from them to then use Rachel as the stand-in for Israel, as the matriarch of Israel, looking back out and now weeping over the exile that had happened. When it says weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they were not, if you look at the context of Jeremiah 31, it is very clearly speaking about the exile. She is weeping metaphorically over the exile, and I mean, if you just keep reading the next two verses in Jeremiah 31, God actually says not to weep because Israel will return from exile. Here's verse 16. Thus saith the Lord, refrain thy voice from weeping and thine eyes from tears, for thy work shall be rewarded, saith the Lord, and they shall come again from the land of the enemy. And there is hope in your end, says the Lord, that your children will come again to their own border. So this was not Jeremiah several hundred years before Jesus getting secret divine knowledge that in several centuries a ruler would kill a bunch of children that would make some woman named Rachel cry over the loss of her babies. No, it's Jeremiah speaking metaphorically, using language from Israel's history to talk about the sadness of the exile and all the horror of the exile, and to say, you know what, actually, as bad as it seems right now, it's going to get better. We're going to end up back in the land. And so Matthew then jumps in, he sees that, and he says, okay, well, what if I can present Jesus as the return from exile? Yes, we already came back into the land. Yes, the exile has technically ended, but we're not in control of the land. We are under a foreign power. And so did the exile really end? I mean, we're kind of exiled in our own land. Like, we're not controlling our land. So what if Jesus is the ultimate version of this? What if we really didn't return from exile like we thought we did, and we need another return that starts with this guy I'm telling you the story of? And see, I think viewing the passage that way is so much more life-giving, because if all you're doing is viewing this as the very cut and dry, there was a prophecy through Jeremiah that all of this would happen in the time of Jesus, then you have to see God as forcing the events of Jesus' time in order to happen exactly as he said they would happen hundreds of years earlier. And if that's the case, then that means that God forced all of those babies in Bethlehem to die just to quote unquote fulfill a prophecy from hundreds of years before that he supposedly wrote himself. So could he not have worded it differently where innocents didn't have to die? I mean, even if we're looking at the Christmas story in Matthew, there is literally no reason for God to direct the wise men to Herod in order to get to Jesus. He could have just directed them straight to Jesus. But by having the star go over Jerusalem, that notified Herod, which then had him go on this murderous rampage. If God really was in control of all of this, there was zero reason why it had to happen that they go to Jerusalem. If he was really leading them by this star, he could have just taken them straight to Bethlehem and saved the murder of those babies. Now, as I said before, Bethlehem is actually a really small town at the time of Jesus. So a lot of scholars would say that if we're going off of this idea that Herod killed, all the children 2 and under, it probably was only 25 to 50 max. Now, I realize that's still awful. I think a lot of us just have this idea of like hundreds of babies dying in this massacre. It probably would have been a couple dozen max. And again, that is still awful. I'm not trying to say, oh, it's okay because it was only a couple dozen. No, in fact, I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying that is still horrifyingly bad and something that there is no reason other than this prophecy and other than trying to match the story of Exodus where you have this evil ruler trying to kill a bunch of babies. There is no other reason for God to do this. So if you are taking this view that this is prophecy, that God then orchestrated all of the events to happen exactly according to prophecy that he himself established hundreds of years earlier, then I would argue that you have a moral monster of a God who forced innocent babies to die for absolutely no reason. He could have completely rewritten that script so that literally every other part of the story happened aside from that one little detail. But he didn't. So that's why I think we have to move past this cut and dry, very intentional prophecy and fulfillment mindset that so many Christians have, to realize that Matthew is taking passages that originally had nothing to do with Jesus. They were very meaningful in their own time and place, and he is now reinterpreting the events that have happened in light of these. So it's his putting a spin on these texts instead of God forcing it to happen this way. I think that makes for a better picture of God than the traditional view that so many people have. We are now at the last fulfillment passage that Matthew mentions in the birth account. Again, there are more after this in the next several chapters, but for time's sake, we have to limit to the birth account since we're talking about Christmas. And he arose, this is Matthew 2:21, he arose and took the young child and his mother and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, just a little note there, of God is actually not in any of the texts that I can find. So the King James and some other translations say of God there, and it really doesn't have to. It's literally just being warned in a dream. But for some reason, many of our English Bibles like to add in those 2 words there. It's not something they tend to do in other places, but that is one. Being warned in a dream, he turned aside into the parts of Galilee, and he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, he shall be called a Nazarene. Now, this one is probably the most difficult of Matthew's references because there is no passage in Scripture, not a prophecy, not even just a passing reference to some other character that says he will be called a Nazarene. So various theories have been proposed over the years of what Matthew intended with this. Some people think maybe he is referencing a passage that would have been sacred to him that we don't have record of. Like it didn't make it into the Hebrew Bible, it didn't make it into the Christian canon, and we don't know what he's referencing. But maybe there was some ancient text that said this, and so he drew on that as a prophecy. Possible. I don't think that's necessarily that likely. Another option some people have gone with is that he was drawing off of Nazarite. In ancient Israel, only one particular clan could be priests. It was the Levites. It was not something you chose to do. It's not like today someone wants to go be a minister and so they go to college for it or whatever. Like you were going to be a priest if you were in this family line. You didn't get a choice. And if you were outside of it, you didn't get to become a priest. You know, you didn't get to become a Levite. You had to come from this Levitical line. And then even more specifically through like the line of Aaron, Moses' brother. But there was provision in the Torah for people who wanted to live like a priest, try to get as spiritually close to God as they could, you know, living almost like a monastic life, but they weren't Levites. So it's basically living like a Levite, even though you aren't. And that's called a Nazarite. So much of the Nazarite vow was pretty much a vow to live as if you were a priest, even though you weren't actually working in the temple. Now, there's actually not a lot in the Tanakh about Nazarites and what's expected of them. It seems like it was pretty much always expected to be a temporary agreement, that this was just something you did like, you know, almost like a fast. You know, if you take a few days to fast or something like that for a spiritual reason. It's kind of like that, you know, but maybe for a week or several weeks or maybe even a few months or a couple years. But it wasn't a lifetime thing, except in very rare instances of someone like Samson that we have recorded in Judges, or also John the Baptizer in the Gospels. Now, while Nazareth and Nazarite do sound similar, they aren't the same thing. Nazarite is the name of the vow that they would take to live like a priest. Nazareth was a place name, and there's some debate over what exactly the name Nazareth would mean, but the majority of scholars think it comes from the root word netzer, which would mean a branch, like you have a tree branch. And in fact, there are several instances in the biblical prophets that speak of a branch of David. So, you know, you have the idea of like a family tree, saying that from the family tree of David, there's going to be a branch of someone who is going to be just like David. So it seems like Matthew is probably drawing off of this idea of the branch of the netzer and using some clever wordplay because he knew that Jesus came from Nazareth. So he's using this wordplay of a branch that he wants to, you know, present Jesus as this new David while also getting in that he came from Nazareth. So it seems like in this case, Matthew actually made up his own prophecy using some clever wordplay. There you have it, folks. That is every explicitly stated prophecy, quote unquote, of Jesus' birth. And it is all in Matthew. There is no other passage of scripture that explicitly says this happened at Jesus' birth in order to fulfill this former thing. So I realize we draw in a lot of other passages, and you'll hear people talk about the dozens or even hundreds of prophecies about Jesus, and it's a very subjective number. You know, like, for example, I saw some people trying to say that, you know, you have the prophecy in Genesis 12:3 to Abraham that I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and in you will all families of the earth be blessed. And they'll say, okay, that was a prophecy that was actually fulfilled in Jesus. And then they'll look at how it got extended later on to Isaac and then again to his son Jacob, and they'll say, see, that's two more prophecies about Jesus right there. And it's like, I get what you're trying to do, but let's also not force it too much, especially for people who are trying to be biblicists and just go off of what the text says. Maybe we should actually just go off of what the text says instead of reading in all this extra. And like I said at the start of the episode, this is not some attempt to take Jesus out of the Bible or to lessen the impact, and not at all. I just wish that we would be more honest with what is actually there. You know, if you started a new job and somebody told you, every week you get $1,000 bonus, and then you're there for, say, a month, and you didn't once get $1,000 bonus at the end of a week. Okay, is that the fault of the job? No, most jobs don't do that. Is that your fault? No, probably not, because, again, most jobs don't do that. It's the fault of the person who promised you something that wasn't actually real. Whoever told you that's what you should expect with the new job is the problem. Not the job, and not you. The job is what it is, and you are what you are, but that person misrepresented what the job was to you. And so often that's what happens with the Bible. We get pissed off. We hear this kind of thing, and we get really scared or ticked off either at the Bible and God, or sometimes at the person who's presenting it in my position, without realizing that's not the problem. The problem is not with the Bible, and the problem isn't with the presenter. The problem is with the expectations that we have been told to have of this text that weren't even there in the first place. So I think this is how we best elevate Scripture to a high status in our minds and give it the authority that it deserves, is by just letting it be what it's supposed to be. And I've heard from other people as well, this is true for me and I've heard it for others, that once you start viewing the Bible this way, yes, it's a big hurdle to get over mentally, but once it clicks for you, you actually start to appreciate the Bible more because you're no longer trying to force in Jesus where the original audience would not have seen him. You're just trying to understand the passage itself. And then that helps you not just understand that passage, but then better appreciate the New Testament and the stories of Jesus. And it helps. The truth helps, right? Sometimes it hurts, but once you get past the hurt, it helps because you're able to see what's actually there. So, what's more powerful, history or prophecy? Well, I think you could argue that prophecy has quite a bit of power because we've been reading these texts this way for hundreds of years in Christianity, and look at the sway it has over our minds. Look at how difficult it is to unravel some of this. But I think the strongest power is in the truth. And the truth is history. The truth is what happened. So I think the closer we can get back to an understanding of that, the more powerful these texts will be in our lives. And I realize there is so much more we could have gone to with this episode. We're definitely going to have to do a part 2 next year for this prophecy discussion. Because while Luke does not explicitly state this happened in order to fill full like Matthew did, there is one instance in the birth narrative where there is fulfillment language. It's not spoken by the author like Matthew did. Like Luke doesn't ever say that. He actually puts it in the mouth of Zacharias, the priest. And then there's a couple other almost prophecies you can kind of talk about, like with Simeon, once baby Jesus is brought into the temple for the cleansing ritual. There's other stuff we can talk about there. And, the more I did this study too, the more I realized there's a lot of passages that we think are prophecies of Jesus' birth that really aren't. Like, they don't ever claim to be. Like Genesis 3:15, I'll put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. It will bruise your head and he will bruise your heel. Like, I heard so much that because it says her seed, this is a prophecy of the virgin birth. Well, you can go back to the episode we did on Genesis 3, and I think it was the second half. I think we split that chapter up into 2. I talk about why that's not actually a useful interpretation of that passage. That's a misapplication of the Hebrew grammar. And there's all other kinds of passages like that we could look at. So I would love to hear from you. Would you like to have a part 2 to this episode next year? And are there any passages of scripture that you had heard were prophecies of Jesus that you would like us to talk about? As always, you can write in on our socials, you can email us, you can use the form on the homepage, and now we have a new Discord chat as well. So you can go on our socials, get the link for the private Discord chat, and we can keep the conversation going about the episodes on there. I would love to hear from you all, your thoughts on all of this. But with all that being said, this is going to wrap it up for us for the year with the podcast. So I just want to say we have had a fantastic year here with the podcast. It has grown significantly. We've had some awesome guests on. We've experimented with new series and special events, and it's been awesome. We could not do it without you all and your support. So thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for rating and reviewing. It goes a long way. For those of you who support us, we really appreciate it. We are adamant about making sure that this content stays free. I would honestly stop doing the podcast before I started charging for it. Nothing against people who do like Patreon, paid wall stuff with that. But for us, this is something I want to make sure everyone has access to for free. That way there is never a barrier other than just the time it takes to listen to the episode to get this information. I want to be able to be a help without causing any financial burden. But there is still a cost to doing the podcast. So we do have options like Patreon where you can give to help the podcast. And it's not the kind of thing where we give you extra stuff behind a paywall. It's just helping to cover some of the costs that we have. So if that's something you're interested in, we do have a support us tab on the website, and we really appreciate anything done through that. The podcast will be back next year in mid-January. We're going to take a couple weeks off for the holidays, and then we'll be starting back up with our Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month. We have a couple great episodes lined up for you for that we've already been working on. And then another special episode or two that we have planned for the beginning of February before we hop into an Exodus series. Cannot wait for all of that. Again, love you all. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this. I hope you all have a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and until next year, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.